We've already talked about a few micronations such as San Marino, Liechtenstein and Andorra on this channel, but what I'm presenting to you today tops them all. It's about the sea fortress. Yes, you heard that right, the smallest country in the world was proclaimed on this platform, which was abandoned after the Second World War, the Principality of Sealand. Although the sea fortress is located in the territorial waters of the United Kingdom, it is ruled by a British family with its own laws and regulations and does not tolerate any interference from other states. The Principality prints its own passports, has its own currency and even has its own complete constitution. So it's high time we took a closer look at this micronation. How did Sealand come into being, why did the Germans want to conquer the island in the meantime, and why is the self-proclaimed principality still tolerated by the British today? We look at all these questions in today's video. The origins of Sealand date back to the Second World War. The British built numerous sea fortresses early on to defend against German air and sea attacks. However, after the end of the war, the defense platforms lost their usefulness, were abandoned by the soldiers and now stood deserted off the coast of Great Britain. However, the situation changed from the 60s onwards, and this had to do with radio in particular. At that time, there was only BBC Radio, which had a virtual monopoly. But as young people in the 60s became more self-confident, new radio stations emerged that played music genres that were frowned upon at the time, such as rock and roll. However, as these were quickly banned by the British authorities, they needed a location outside the British sphere of influence, and this is where the sea forts came into play. At the time, these were still outside British territorial waters and offered an ideal retreat for the so-called pirate radio stations from the Broadcasting Act. Patrick Roy Bates, a former major in the British Army, had the idea of occupying one of the forts in order to set up his own transmitter there. He wisely chose the island furthest away from the mainland. The British authorities quickly saw through the trick and passed the Marine Broadcasting Offences Act, which banned British radio stations outside territorial waters. As a result, almost all the occupants of the artificial islands left their retreats, except for one, Patrick Roy Bates. In the meantime, he lost interest in radio and had a new, much more far-reaching idea. He wanted to found his own state. No sooner said than done. He gathered his family and a few loyal followers around him, and on the 2nd of September in the year 1967, he actually proclaimed the Principality of Sealand. Naturally, the British government did not like this at all and immediately sent the Royal Navy to expel him and his entourage. However, the self-proclaimed prince acted with such self-confidence that he is said to have fired several shots in the direction of the landing craft. However, as the British government wanted to avoid an exchange of fire at all costs, they withdrew. It should be noted that the incident made big headlines in the British press at the time, and many of the population sympathized with the rebel. The government therefore wanted to avoid bloody images at all costs and decided to take legal action. However, this also failed. The court declared that it had no jurisdiction, as the sea fortress was located outside British territory in international waters. At that time, the nautical mile limit was much smaller than it is today. And so, although the authorities repeatedly paid visits to Bates and his entourage, he always invoked the court's ruling that his principality was not part of the United Kingdom. Despite its tiny size, the principality has already been involved in wars. In the year 1978, some inhabitants of German and Dutch origin who wanted to turn the platform into a luxury hotel staged a coup. They took the prince's son hostage and demanded that the monarch be deposed. However, he acted as energetically as ever and was able to recapture the island with a few heavily armed men. He now took the putschists as prisoners of war. The German and Dutch governments demanded their immediate release. This also happened in the case of the Dutch, but the two Germans had Sealand passports, which is why the prince sentenced them to life imprisonment at his own discretion. Only when the German government sent its own envoys to the island did he release them. He saw this establishment of diplomatic relations as de facto recognition of his state by the Federal Republic of Germany. In reality, however, the principality is not recognized by any sovereign state in the world. Nevertheless, Sealand acts as a state in its own right and usually gets away with it. The form of government is a constitutional monarchy with succession, and Sealand was declared a free trade zone at an early stage with an explicit waiver of gambling duties. Sealand has its own passports, the Sealand dollar, and its own stamps. Even though the fortress island is now in British waters following changes to the law of the sea, the British government appears to have given up negotiations. The prince, now the son of the deceased founder, invokes international law. As the British had given up their claims in the meantime, the platform had become no man's land and his claim to rule was therefore legitimate. The case has been the subject of persistent debate among international lawyers for decades, with differing opinions. All to the advantage of the prince, who continues to rule his sea fortress to this day. However, if you are now thinking of founding your own state in international waters, I am sorry to disappoint you. Back in the 1980s, the founding of such states was ruled out for the future. From now on, the nearest neighboring state is responsible for all new foundations. However, Sealand is an exception as it existed before the legislation and will probably remain the only principality of its kind forever.